All right. Story number 2 this morning has to do with a border bill in Canada that puts more reliance on the U.S., I think is what I was getting out of this. So, complete blind spot issue again. So, our first story was a blind spot for the left. This is a blind spot for the right. 57% left-leaning distribution, 36% center with a 7% right-leaning. And it says border bill raised questions about expanded data sharing with the U.S., and this is, like I said, it's a Canadian-based story, so we're coming at it from a Canadian point of view when they're talking about this. I always like to, like I said, sort my stories by factuality, and I have a story from The Conversation pulled up here. This is why Canada's Strong Borders Act is troublesome as Donald Trump is as troublesome as Donald Trump's travel bans. Was it just a coincidence that within days of Canada's Liberal government announcing Bill C-2, the Strong Borders Act, Donald Trump's administration in the United States released its long-anticipated travel ban? Perhaps, but the timing should also highlight the long-time shared border saga between Canada and the U.S. and should compel Canada to carve its own path. Like Trump's 2017 travel ban, his 2025 directive significantly prevent or limit the access of U.S. citizens from 12 mostly African and Middle Eastern countries, with more possibly on the horizon. It's likely to face judicial challenges and may not survive for long. In contrast, Bill C-2 would lead to several significant and broad statutory changes that Canadians would contend with for years to come. Data privacy concerns. Days before the Trump announcement, the Canadian government advanced the controversial Strong Borders Act, covering a wide swath of proposed legislative changes, from intensified border security measures to more restrictive immigration and asylum policies. Embedded within the proposed legislation, as Canadian law professor Michael Gist and others have pointed out, are significant risks to digital privacy, along with increased executive authority, also known as warrantless powers, without judicial or civilian oversight. That's not troublesome. In these respects, proposed Canadian legislation could be considered more worrisome than Trump's travel bans. In the fog of the ongoing trade war between the U.S. and Canada, the focus on American tariffs and their economic impact, but little attention is being paid to Canada's long-standing coordination and cooperation with the U.S. in terms of border management. Unfortunately, Canada has a history of appeasing the U.S. border, and the period following 9/11 is worth noting. Increased coordination post 9/11. Successive Canada-U.S. border agreements have brought about significant institutional changes and reform. These include the Smart Border Declaration signed shortly after 9/11 and the Beyond the Border inked a decade later between Barack Obama and Stephen Harper governments. These agreements included greater reliance on biometric and surveillance technology, bi-national information sharing, and accelerated, robust, coordinated, and cooperative border enforcement, specifically the Shipwriter program and the Integrated Border Enforcement Team. The early 2000s saw the rise of new institutions such as the Canadian Border Services Agency and the Canadian Air Transportation Security Authority, along with the significant policy changes that included prolific and more robust American pre-clearance for people and goods, and authorizing CBSA agents to carry firearms, which was once controversial. Frequently, these reforms were in response to American pressure or reactionary U.S. policies. The Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, for example, is an American policy that has compelled travelers to produce passports when crossing the U.S. border for almost 20 years. In contrast to the elbows-up rhetoric of the last several months, Canada hastily made changes to its border policy. The narrative of cooperative and collaborative U.S.-Canadian border management, however, has not always been as it appeared. Frequently, negotiations and cooperations were difficult and not without costs some autonomy in Canada's border management. Man, I am struggling this morning. I apologize. In the past years, there have been increasing concerns about the impact of potential increases in the asylum claims in Canada because of American policies. Those raising concerns often make reference to Roxham Road, the unofficial border crossing that thrived during the last Trump administration due to a loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. What? I don't know what the Roxham Road is. I guess I need to educate myself on that. Such gaps in legislation were modestly addressed, including the proposed Bill C-2, which would require arriving immigrants to claim asylum within 14 days of arrival. After that time, claimants will not receive a hearing and be subject to deportation. It's troubling to contemplate deporting asylum seekers amid the ongoing deportation spectacle in the U.S. being carried out by Immigration and Customs Enforcement during the Trump administration. Amid renewed American pressures under Trump and a history of border cooperation, it's not surprising Prime Minister Mark Carney is following his predecessor in trying to appease the U.S. president via Canadian border policy. And because asylum claimants often languish for up to 2 years in Canada's immigration and asylum system, it's clear there are problems. But that doesn't preclude the need to think critically about sweeping powers proposed in Bill C-2. In particular, enhanced executive powers in many cases by institutions that have no civilian oversight must be scrutinized. Many of these changes are reminiscent of the kind of cooperative and sometimes coercive border policies that emerged in the post-9/11 years, but it could be argued that Canadians have expressed elbows-up responses to American pressures to reimagine our borders almost 25 years ago. Furthermore, these changes serve as a reminder that cooperative and coordinative management of our borders is increasingly baked in, and despite tariff rhetoric, that's unlikely to change dramatically without significant pushback from Canadians. Revisionist history. Holy smokes. It's worth reflecting on the nostalgic and revisionist accounts of the coercive and not truly cooperative and collaborative post-9/11 border security management, especially in the heat of the ongoing Canada-U.S. trade war. Canadians should remember they lived during a time of deep integration in borders management, but Canada can always assert its own interest and marshal its own resources to manage borders of those who cross it. In the long Canada-U.S. relationship, coercion is often masqueraded as cooperation. There are far fewer coincidences in border policy than we might think, possibly including the timing of the Strong Border Act, but Canada must always evaluate its policies in terms of whether they serve Canadians, not American interests. Unlike Trump's administration travel bans and deportations, Bill C-2 introduces a wide swath of changes Canadians could grapple with for decades. So it sounds like a version of the Patriot Act for Canada. It doesn't sound great. I'm not gonna lie, it doesn't sound great. So, hey, thanks for watching that clip from Nightly News this morning. I'm Cousin Matt. Please make sure to drop the video a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure that notifications are on, so that otherwise, how are you gonna know when my videos come out, right? Anyway, thanks, take care, and we'll see you on the next one.